Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. Now, if you've been a Christian for any amount of time, what I just read, a lot of your friends think you're crazy for believing it. That's the truth, right? A lot of your friends, okay, maybe they don't think you're crazy. Maybe they just do that nod. You know the nod I'm talking about? Okay. Of course, it's the same kind of nod that people did, well, for centuries, whenever you would read sections in the Bible that talked about these people called the Hittites. And up till the 1800s, the Hittites were considered the Achilles heel of the Christian faith, because no thinking person, no educated scholar would ever believe the Bible because it mentions the Hittites. And then the year 1834 came along, and some French dude was digging in the desert, and lo and behold, he found something. He didn't even know what he found. It wasn't translated for another 50 years. And then they started to realize, oh wait, those Hittites. Never mind, I'm changing the subject now. Because they went on to another crisis. They ignored the fact that for the previous 1700 years, they had mocked the Christian faith, and the Jewish faith for that matter, because of its mention of the Hittites. But as you started to dig back and look into the annals of history, you started to see that the Hittites had been there all along if you had been able to see them, if you had known what to look for. Let me fast forward a good bit. Let's go to the year 1994. It was 30 years ago, almost. And in a period of 20 seconds, there had been an earthquake in LA, in the San Fernando Valley. For those of us who were alive at the time, you might have remembered seeing the footage of bridges just collapsing, of overpasses like falling out of the sky and landing. And the city's power was out for days. The radio stations, they went dark. TV stations, they went dark. For those of you who only know what streaming is, that's what we used to watch before we did streaming, okay? Okay? Just FYI. And in the days that followed, when there was nothing to watch and nothing to listen to, people decided they'd go outside. And that's when the phone calls started coming to the local observatory. People were saying, they were giving these panicked phone calls where they're giving reports of a strange sky. They speculated that perhaps this silver cloud that was above them was somehow responsible for the earthquake that they had just experienced. Well, after the calls kept rolling in, the director of this observatory, he wanted to figure out what they were seeing that was bothering them so much. It's called the Milky Way, folks. And if you would ask a person 60 years ago, does the Milky Way exist? They would say, that's a myth. That's a legend. That's something that only those uneducated folks in rural areas talk about seeing. What's my point? My point is simply this. There are many today who are just as blind to what this passage teaches us as those people 30 years were to the Milky Way, and as people 200 years ago were to the Hittite nation. You can't see the literary Milky Way that stares you in the face and And if that's you, I want you to understand this. I'm giving you a 1,000% pass here, because part of that is your culture. As you are coming to the Bible, you are coming as a Westerner, most likely. You are coming as someone who looks back on modernism as if it's a quaint thing, because we're postmodernists now, thank you very much. We are not the ones who measure whether truth is. We're the ones who say, what is truth? Which, by the way, is the same thing that a man who was trying Jesus once said. But Pontius Pilate aside, your Western postmodernism has blinded you to the text. So what you have to do, if you're going to read this passage the right way, is you need to turn off your postmodernism, turn off your presuppositions. I did not say to turn off your brain, because they are not the same thing. You do not have to turn off your brain in order to understand what Moses is trying to communicate to the people of Israel as they are about to enter into the land of Canaan in the beginning of the book of Genesis. You must strip your culture away, however, to read this text. And you must engage something else: humility. You must read this passage humbly. And really, any ancient text or any modern text, you must read it sympathetically. You must read it humbly in order to get out of it what you are intended to receive. In order to receive this one simple message, that a loving God wants you to experience a life of flourishing. That's what this passage is all about. That's what this passage is saying. Indeed, that is what the entire book of Genesis is all about. But a loving God wants you to experience a life of flourishing. Now, if someone on the other side of the lens is new to studying the Bible, which is a library of ancient Eastern literature, I just want to give you 3 tips in how to read the Bible. Real quick, 3 words. The word observation, the word interpretation, the word application. These are the ways that you enter into the Bible text. First, observation. What do you need to do? You need to ask all sorts of questions of this text, and you need to be asking the why, what, where, how, all that sort of thing. And we're going to get to that in just a second. We're going to ask 3 questions, 3 big questions of this text. So what do I see? Look for patterns. So that's the first tip on how to get the Bible, the message, to read it for all that it's worth. Second thing is to look for interpretation. How do you do that? You're going from what do I see to what does this mean? And one big hint there is you might want to start asking yourself, what kind of literature is this? Because some people will say that what we've just read is poetry, and there's about 2 verses in it that are actual poetry. But it doesn't exactly read like prose either. It's kind of like it's a poetic kind of prose. And maybe you notice the patterns that keep emerging time and time again as you're reading through this passage. This passage is almost its own genre unto itself, its own style of literature, because of the amount of repetition that goes on. It has this rhythm, this cadence when you're reading it in English, and even more so in the original language. So I call it poetic prose. That's what the first chapter of Genesis is. Should you read it as if it were prose? Yes. You should read it in the same sort of way that maybe you would read, say, a news report. But you need to read it differently. You can't be reading it in your Western way. You need to be reading it in an Eastern way, understanding everything that's going on underneath the surface. And we'll unearth that in just a second. Finally, so observations. What do I see? Interpretation. What does it mean? Application. What does it mean for me? How am I similar to these people that I'm reading about? How am I different? Are there any lasting principles that I can find in this text that would apply to me in my world? And the answer is yes. But you have to see how. And that takes work to be able to do it. Reading the Bible takes work. But reading any kind of literature takes work. And it's well worth your time and your investment. So with that little primer on how to read the Bible and get a little bit more out of it, let's start here. Let's just ask some basic questions of this text. Who is this about? What happens? How does it happen? 3 basic questions. Who, what, how? Now, I'm going to tell you a question you should not be asking of this text, and I'll be able to show you a little bit more. Don't do the when thing. Don't do the when. Now, and I'll be able to explain it to you. It's not a cop-out. It's just that if you're reading the when, you're reading this like someone who's from Switzerland. And you've got your timepiece right here, yeah? And that's not how you read it. You read it like a Middle Easterner in an ancient time. That's how you read this passage, because that's who wrote this. So let's talk about some of the basics here. Point 1, who is this about? Let me give you a hint. It's in verse 1. In the beginning, God. Okay, so God is the subject. God is the subject of the entire Bible, of the entire library of all 66 books of the Bible. Especially that's true here. So who is this about? This is about God. And this primarily is telling us about what God's character is like. How are we going to know that? We're going to know that by what he does. But what is point 2? We're still in who. Okay, so stay with me in the who. The who is asking basic questions. If you want to know God, part of what you need to be able to ask about the person who's hearing about this God is ask yourself, what did they know? Did they know the scientific method? Answer, no. They didn't know the scientific method because this is 4,000 years ago, guys. They made observations and they would see things taking place. And what would happen is they would see something taking place, and a lot of times that would form a religion around that observation that they made, because they had a supernatural mindset towards seeing things. And there are times in which we would greatly benefit from that kind of a mindset. But do they have scientific theories? No. But because of their supernatural bent, that should be a tip to you of how you're supposed to be reading this. Because here's something they knew about that you don't know about, most likely, unless maybe you've taken an Old Testament class on this subject. This is not a book about evolution. This is not a passage on how to hammer your atheist friends over the head. That's not what that's here for. It's here to encourage Israelites to enter into the land of Canaan during a time of chaos when they're scared. That's why the book's here. That's why it's here. So we need to remember that. And here's something that was also going on in the background. They had all sorts of friends from Egypt because they'd lived there for 400 years, right? And so they knew all about the Egyptian gods. And they also knew all about the Babylonian gods as well. There were, in the Egyptian society, there were more than 30 creation stories from the Egyptian standpoint. And they had heard them all. Because did they have Netflix back then? No. This was Netflix. This was Netflix. And so they knew all these stories and they heard all these stories. And so they were very familiar with the Egyptian stories. They were familiar with the Babylonian stories. And they were familiar with all the gods that each of these religions in these various countries had. And so in this first sentence, Moses writes something that is just radical. In the beginning, God, one God, created the skies and the land. That's how they would read this, or how they would hear it when it was read to them, more likely. So, one God made all of this. That's radically different. And how did he make this? As you start to read through this passage, and we'll look at what the content is in a very broad sense. Honestly, you could spend 13 weeks or so in this one chapter alone. I can't do that to myself, let alone to you, okay? So we're not going to do that. We're going to spend 2 or 3 weeks maybe here. Definitely 2. But so what would they see here? They would see a God who was more like an artist, who is like a sculptor. In all of the descriptions that are being woven here by Moses, what is he saying to them? He's saying, in the beginning, God created this stuff, and it wasn't ready yet. It was a place that was not, it did not have good living conditions. And so then God starts sculpting this beautiful thing, and he goes day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, and then day 7 that we're familiar with, hopefully, to some extent in this passage. But here's what he's describing in all of this passage God is. God is singular. God is loving. God is transcendent, and yet God is present. God is personal. God is generous. God is creative. These are all the kinds of attributes of God that you can glean through reading this passage, which, by the way, is much shorter than other competing Babylonian stories of creation like the Enuma Elish, which takes about 45 minutes to an hour and a half, depending on what speed you have it reading for you on YouTube. You know how long the Enuma Elish is of a similar sort of length. The Epic of Gilgamesh, that they're much, much, much longer. This is a much shorter passage, much more concise, and yet in it we read lots of things about who this God is. Now let's compare this, what I've said about God, who is singular, who is loving, who is transcendent, who is present, who is generous, who is creative. What do we know about those other gods in those other places? If we're an Israelite, what do we know about them? Well, we know that those gods are selfish, warring, that they're spectators, that they're lazy, that they're powerful and yet they're undisciplined, and that they are slaves to their own lusts and desires. But other than that, not much. This is what we know about the Babylonian gods. If you go and you listen to the Enuma Elish as one example of it, you have this god, Marduk, who kills this god over here, and in splitting this god open, it makes the rivers. That's the Tigris and the Euphrates. That's the battle that takes place. How does creation take place? By killing. How does God do? Well, that's what our next passage, our next segment is about. How, or rather, what happens? We'll get to how in just a second. In contrast to the pagan gods who shape the world by warring and by consuming, God carefully creates. It's almost like you can see him laying out the skies above, that he spreads them out. He scans the chaos. He orders it to do what he wants it to do. And then he rests. It's so much more peaceful. It's easy to be peaceful when you're the one and only true God. When you're a God who's living, and when you're a God who speaks things into existence. And so you should see that this is a loving God. Partly because of this God who speaks these things into existence. And as he speaks, it works his creative power. It works his sculpting of an entire cosmos. As he's doing this, he is also making a place that is friendly for his people. It is the ultimate expression of love. He is making a new world. Now, in one of the examples, in the Enuma Elish, after Marduk does all of his destruction and stuff and makes mountains by having a wrestling match, and he gets angry at the humans because they're too loud, you know, that's the kind of text that you have in these Babylonian texts. Then all the people, all the other gods, they say, you know, it's great what you did with all this creation thing, but it's going to be so much work. And Marduk says, oh, that's okay. That's what I made people for. They're going to do all the work, and they'll feed us. I want you to get this big contrast. That the God who makes all these things by the word of his power in the space of 6 days, and all very good, that when he does this, he gives you food. I want you to see the polar difference. This would, in literature, is what's called a polemic. This is a comparison where Moses is purposefully showing you how incredibly different from the Babylonian gods the God of the Hebrews is. He is entirely different. Now, why do I bring this up? Because if you read any bit on the internet, you'll hear people saying, oh yeah, the Bible, it just stole all this Babylonian stuff. It stole the Gilgamesh and all the blah, blah, blah. Yes, it stole it to show how, relatively speaking, dumb they are in comparison to the God of the Bible. It's doing that on purpose. The reason why the Noah story and the Gilgamesh story is simple is because God is saying, yes, you've heard all the stories. Now let me speak to you the truth. Let me tell you what God's really like. God's not angry at you, Israelite. He's going to bring you into a good land, a place where you can prosper, a place where you can flourish, a place where, like him, you will engage in work. God works good. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week. But he's going to engage in work and then he's going to rest. And you too, Israelite, you're supposed to engage in work and rest. I mean, how does humanity come about? I was listening to a sermon by Tim Keller yesterday, and I'll gladly proclaim that it was Tim Keller who said this. He said, where does humanity come from? From God digging a ditch. He's digging a ditch, and he takes man out of the earth. Work is where we came from, because work is good. Work is not a punishment. Work is what God does. It is the very purpose that we have. Now, some of us get paid for our work, some of us don't, but the point is that all of us must work, that this is a good thing. So this is what happens in this passage. Now, how does it happen? As I mentioned before, by the word of God's power. He speaks the universe into existence. Really, it's more like he takes the things that he has already spoken into existence. And this passage does not say that God created everything out of nothing. But Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3 says that. So that's where we get that it's called, that's called creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. And by the way, that notion is something that absolutely has plagued scientists for years. Because when you start to read them and they start to speak frankly, they're like, none of us really know. I mean, we know a bit here, we know a bit there, but we don't have the whole ball of wax. None of us knows where we come from. In fact, let me read to you. I was going to have this at the end, but let me just bring it to the top of the stack. This is something that Albert Einstein said when he was asked, "What do you believe about God?" He said, "I'm not an atheist. I don't think I can call myself a pantheist. The problem involved is too vast for our limited minds. We are in a position of a little child entering a huge library filled with books in many languages. The child knows someone must have written those books. It does not know how. It does not understand the languages in which they are written. The child dimly suspects a mysterious order in the arrangement of the books, but doesn't know what it is." That, it seems to me, is the attitude of even the most intelligent human being toward God. We see the universe marvelously arranged and obeying certain laws, but only dimly understand these laws. This is Einstein, guys, the E equals MC squared guy, the crazy haired guy. Also the guy who needed someone to help him get across the Yale campus, but we'll put that on the side as well. All of that is who Albert Einstein was. And that's what he said about what the universe looks like. Someone who had peered into its mysteries as deeply as probably anyone ever has. And that's what he said about God. So how does creation happen? Well, here's the thing. You don't have to know everyone. You don't have to know everything. You just have to know the one who knows everything. You just have to have that as a source. And that's what we call faith. And if you're a scientist or if you're of a more naturalistic bent and you're like, well, I'm not going to take the Bible on faith. Well, you do whenever you enter into a classroom. Every time that you go and you read a science book, you are taking things on faith because you will never be able to verify Maxwell's equations. How do I know that Maxwell really wrote those equations down? If you're going to have that same kind of skeptical kind of mindset towards science that you have towards the Bible, you will never know anything at all. Because if you're going to learn anything about drag coefficients, you're going to have to take some scientist's word for it. That's called faith. And by the way, that's also how you keep from going crazy and getting overworked. It's also called being smart. This is what faith is. But back to the theories of creation. How many days? How much time? When, Pastor Bill? That's a really good way of getting into an argument. And I don't think that after the last 2 years we've been through, who really wants to get in a whole bunch more fighting? Honestly, I don't. I've gone through this whole creationism debate for 30 some odd years, and I'm quite tired of it. To me, it just gets down to this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, you're going to find people who have what I would call a young earth creation viewpoint. And they believe that God created the heavens and the earth. you will also find people who believe that it took billions of years, who also believe God created the heavens and the earth. You will find people who believe in the gap theory. You will find people who believe in the analogical argument. You will find all these different ways of looking at creation. Now, that's before you look at people who have a naturalistic worldview, people who do who look to evolution, say, or who look to something like spontaneous generation. You might remember that old thing that was debunked, I don't know, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. That was a naturalistic explanation about how things come about. Such is the mind of man. You have all the pagan explanations that I've already talked about. But within the biblical realm of looking at the Bible and saying, how did this probably take place? There's really, I lump them into two camps. One camp is what I call the linear camp. They're just gonna look at it like it's a list, you know. First day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day. Or first age, second age, third age, fourth. Doesn't matter. It's just a matter of scale, right? And then there's the literary explanation, the right explanation. It's not. It's not necessarily. But after years and years of being a young earth creation guy who is sympathetic to people who have an old earth view of creation, I think it makes the most sense. But you know what? I have to come to this book with humility. I have to be able to say, after my view, but I could be wrong. Because none of that really matters. My view does not matter. Why? Because who is this about? It's about God. It's about God. So if we're going to get in an argument about how awesome God is, well, that's cool, yeah. But let me just show you something. Go to the slide on the literary framework. This was something that St. Augustine, he noticed this in the 400s. He wrote it in The City of God. A lot of other people have worked on it as well. Basically, we had the first 3 days of creation where they're days of preparation, where the realms or the containers are being made, that the things that you put stuff into. So light is being made. Sky and water is being separated from one another. Land and vegetation, they're being created. And then into each one of these places, you see the sun and the moon, they're put in that category of light on day 4. The birds and the fish, they populate the sky and the water. The land and the animals and the man, they populate the land and the vegetation. And then on day 7, God rests. Here's the reason why it makes a lot of sense. Because this is how Hebrews write things. It makes Hebrew sense. If you're trying to come in with some sort of a Western mindset of I want to be able to nail things down, well, that's great. Make a cabinet. You know, that's great. Build a car. Build a bridge. In general, though, if you're trying to import your Western mindset, you will shipwreck your own faith and the faith of others. Can I humbly say that? Because I've just seen it happen too often. Because that's not what this passage is about. The passage is about a God who creates all this stuff because he's a God of love. That's why. And he's a God who wants you to know that if you live in a world of chaos where things seem like they're not ordered at all, your life is an uncreated mess. You can really identify with Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, where it's formless and empty and void and all that kind of thing. You're like, it makes no sense. It's okay. That's what the world was. And God made it make sense. Guess what he can do for you? He can make your world make sense. All he has to do is speak into it. That's all he has to do. And all you have to do is say, Lord, I believe. That's all it gets down to. Now, this makes a huge difference. If you want a world of justice, you want this kind of a world. If you want a world where oppression ceases, you want this kind of a world. If you want a world where work makes sense, you want this kind of a world. If you want this kind of a world where you can have a family, you want this kind of a world. If you want the kind of world where babies are safe, where black men can walk the streets and not be harmed, you want this kind of a world. This is what you want. If you want racial justice, you want this world. That's the world that God is making. That's why Genesis 1 matters.